Does your child or a family member or friend or possibly you yourself have dyslexia? Would you even know if you have it? It is estimated that 1 in 10 people have dyslexia. That is roughly 40 million people, with only 2 million of them actually being diagnosed. Today, I'm talking to New York State Assembly member Robert Carroll about his legislation that establishes a center in New York for dyslexia and dysgraphia that will help hundreds of thousands who have it or don't know that they have it and don't know what to do. Assembly member Carroll, welcome to Brooklyn 45.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam.
Let's talk first about dyslexia. What is dyslexia?
It's a great question, Sam. So, in a nutshell, dyslexia is a deficit in phonological awareness, the ability for somebody to differentiate sound shaped symbols in written word. And so, this usually manifests itself in a young person having real trouble at the beginning stages of reading and being able to decode text, being able to differentiate the sounds and shapes of words, and then being able to blend them together to become fluid and fluent readers.
What are the symptoms of this learning disability?
So the main symptom, the main issue with children or anybody who struggles with dyslexia that has not been remediated, that has not received some intensive instruction, is the ability to fluidly and fluently read so that they're able to have quick automatic word recognition so that they can easily read books, texts, newspapers, etc. It also can manifest itself in trouble with spelling and with writing from time to time.
Why have so many people gone misdiagnosed?
Well, I think oftentimes, right, people assume that if somebody has a struggle to learn how to read, that they must not be intelligent. But of course, having dyslexia, I have dyslexia. I struggled mightily when I was a young person, but got the remediation and the intensive instruction I needed to eventually become a successful student. Is that there's a disconnect with the ability to make early and significant gains in reading and everything else. So, a young child could have a big vocabulary, could understand what's going on in a classroom, could be very engaged, very thoughtful, very precocious, and then really struggle. And, then this becomes sometimes the tropes or the stereotypes around young boys. Oh, he's wild, or oh, he's lazy. And this just isn't the case, right? And I want to be clear, dyslexia affects both boys and girls, men and women, at equal rates. But it too often there's also great shame, right? Unfortunately, in the United States and in New York in particular, about 1 in 7 adults is functionally illiterate, really can't read. And in some areas, 40, 50% of adults in certain areas have a real struggle reading complex text, that they have low reading proficiency. And people, there's great shame. People don't want to talk about that. One of the reasons I talk and speak about my struggles early on is because I want to try to destigmatize that. I want to say that, look, you can talk about the struggles you had, you can talk about the struggles that you still have, and it will lead to better outcomes and better choices that we can make for our children. I've got 2 young sons. I want to make sure that when they go to school, that they have the resources and the interventions they need if they have some of the same struggles that I had.
Earlier, you said that boys and girls know that they have dyslexia. How about adults? Can you get dyslexia as an adult?
No, so dyslexia is a neurobiological disorder. Um, and so one is born having dyslexia, right? It is It is the wiring of your brain. For 500,000 years, human beings have been speaking to one another like we're doing right now, Sam, right? But for only 5,000 years have we been writing things down. And so the neuroplasticity, and I'm not a neurologist, and so I'm not going to try to play one, but the neuroplasticity and the anatomy of the brain and the way it is wired, those who struggle with dyslexia, they have a deficit when it comes to the phonological awareness. Again, being able to kind of connect sound shape symbols of written words. And that's their main deficit. And so when you diagnose dyslexia early on, you can make real leaps and bounds because the brain has plasticity, and so other parts of the brain can take over those functions, and children can become very successful readers and writers and successful students. As one gets older, it becomes more and more difficult, but there's every day is a day to start. There's no time that's too late. If you or you know somebody who's an adult who struggles with reading or struggling to learn to read, there are great programs. My office funds an adult literacy program at the Brooklyn Public Library where we use evidence-based reading practices, the science of reading, to build, to make sure that adults become fluid and fluent readers by using structured and sequential phonics instruction to help people learn to read. And that's something that I think people don't realize is there's five pillars to literacy. There's phonemic awareness, that is the ability to understand and manipulate sound shape symbols. There's phonics, that's putting together the sounds of words. There's vocabulary, so that's understanding the words. There's reading comprehension, so understanding the full story. And then there's fluency, and what fluency is speed. You want somebody to be able to read at a certain speed so that they can continue to understand it, right? It's the right rhythm for the story or the song, right? You want to have that fluency. You got to put all of those things together. And for too long, Sam, um, we've sometimes been approaching literacy instruction in the wrong way, in a way that assumes that reading is innate and that it's not a learned skill. But of course, it is a learned skill and a complex skill. And that's something that we're trying to change in New York. And that's something that we think the Dyslexia and Dysgraphia Center will do. It will promulgate best practices on how to teach reading and writing. It will provide professional development for teachers and administrators. It will set up best practices for how to screen children for dyslexia so that we know if a student is likely to struggle and they'll need more intensive interventions. And this is something that other states have done, and I'm excited for New York to do so that you don't have to be lucky to learn how to read. I was very lucky that my parents and a teacher at my local public school suspected that I had dyslexia in the first grade and then got me the help I so desperately needed.
That's interesting. There are a lot of parents who are watching this program, parents in their 40s, some in their 50s. Now, when they were a child and it was known that they had dyslexia, or maybe there was suspicion that they had dyslexia, what was available in the classroom to help the kid when they were 30 years ago, 10 years ago?
Well, look, 30, look, I'm 38 years old. I like to let parents know and let, advocates know. It's like, look, I failed the first grade. I failed the second grade. That wasn't a fun time. There wasn't a lot available, and that was very frustrating. I was very lucky that my parents had the means and the opportunity to send me to a wonderful school called the Gateway School and then the Windward School, which specialized in helping students with dyslexia. We can do so much better though now. We know what to do. We know that children with dyslexia can become strong, fluent, and fluid readers. They can become very successful students. What they need is intensive, structured, and sequential phonics instruction for a number of years. The earlier, the better. And so that's what we need to be doing in elementary schools. And if you suspect that your son or daughter is struggling, look, I urge you to reach out to my office, 718-788-7221. We work with advocates um, from across the city who help get children the services they desperately need to make sure that they can learn to read. But the thing that I really urge parents, if you do suspect your son or daughter is struggling, that you act now. You're not gonna magically wake up and your son or daughter is gonna become a strong reader if you keep doing the same thing. What you need to do is you need to realize that there is an issue, and then you need to have a plan to address that problem. And the way to address that problem is going to be through some type of structured literacy program. Sometimes they're called Orton Gillingham, sometimes it's called Wilson. There's a number of them, but they all at their root foundation have the same approach. They are structured, which means that there is a plan to go from A to Z. They're sequential. You don't move on to the next step until you've mastered the step before. And they're rooted in phonics. And they're rooted in the five pillars of literacy. They're making sure that students understand that there are 46 sounds in the English language. You need to be able to recognize them and blend them together to read. And then you need to be able to do that um, with quick succession so that you have the fluidity to be able to understand what you're reading. And then good teachers and good schools, of course, bring in outside, um, bring in curriculum that's culturally relevant, make sure that children have outside knowledge so that they understand the words and the scenarios of the stories and the passages that they're reading. But this is essential. And the problem is in New York City and in really public schools throughout the country, starting in the 1980s, they thought it was a good idea that they would approach literacy instruction through a whole language approach, which was we should expose children to books, we should expose children to the things that they like, and that they will then magically begin to read. It's just not true. It's just not true. And this really harms so many children. Um, and what we need to do is correct that because I know how important, I'm not glib about literacy. I know how easy it is for students to fail. I failed. I know how easy it is for children to struggle. What we need to make sure is that we give those children and all of our children the support and the sound basic instruction that they so desperately need.
So many children are using all these new technologies, and there are some schools, some teachers, even some parents are saying that these new technologies are a disadvantage. Now, when it comes to dyslexia, shouldn't these new technologies contribute to getting over dyslexia?
Sam, it depends, right? I think that, lots of technology is always a great thing. And we always want to use technology and tools to make our lives easier. And I'm not going to pretend that we don't want to do that, right? We're talking, via Zoom right now. We're not in a studio together. So that's a good tool. But I think when it comes to early grades, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds, and they're getting the foundational skills of literacy, we shouldn't be looking at technology to solve that issue. We need to make sure that children have foundational literacy skills and that we spend a lot of time giving them those skills. If later on in life, uh, people want to use technology to assist them, I totally understand that. But it's like, Sam, you're a little older than me, but I remember when we used to take math tests, and we all had the big calculators in junior high and high school, and that there would be certain tests that you couldn't use the calculator, right? You weren't allowed, you had to show your work, you had to show that you could do the problem. That's what we want to make sure we're doing with literacy in early grades. There are great devices that help people assistive technology for reading and for writing. But in early grades, I don't think it's wise to use that technology. I think we want to make sure that children first have those foundational skills.
Now, your bill, your legislation has established a Center for Dyslexia and Dysgraphia in the State Education Department. Why a center that you've established?
So the reason we passed this legislation, and it passed unanimously in both houses in June, is because we need to make sure that schools, right, both large and small, have the best information possible to solve our literacy crisis and to solve the crisis of dyslexia in our schools. So we want administrators and teachers to have a definition of what dyslexia and dysgraphia are. We want them to have guidance on the correct curriculum to use. We want them to be able to access the proper professional development resources so that teachers and administrators can learn more about this. And we want this to be uniform, right? We have 20 million people in New York State. We have, the largest city in the country right here in New York, but we have also rural school districts where there's, 10 kids in a classroom in a small town in the Adirondacks. All of these schools should be given this knowledge and this information. We've also had too long a system where one school was doing one thing and another school was doing something else, and somebody else was pretending the problem didn't exist. This makes sure that we bring everybody up and we bring sunlight to this problem so that we try to solve it. It won't happen in a day, but I've spent almost 9 years in the state legislature. We've passed a number of bills around dyslexia. We passed the Dyslexia Task Force Bill 2 years ago, where we required the state education department to have public hearings so that parents, teachers, advocates, individuals with dyslexia could speak out. And this was their number one recommendation, was that we should have a center. We should come up with a place where we can compile all this information and then disseminate it to folks. And so, we think it's going to be really important in helping to solve this issue.
Well, the center that you've established is for dyslexia and dysgraphia. What's the
Yes.
difference?
So dysgraphia
What
is
a
very
big,
similar to dyslexia. It is a specific learning disability which usually coincides with dyslexia and has to do specifically with writing, having an inability sometimes to be able to kind of express oneself in written word in coherent ways. It usually has issues with spelling. And so it's very similar to dyslexia. And we wanted to make sure that we included that because we wanted to talk about issues language-based, is sometimes a term, language-based learning disabilities, language-based learning differences, and how they manifest. We didn't want to exclude a subset of people who very often the remediations for both of those issues are very similar, and so that's why we included that. But it's a parallel disorder.
you said there are millions of people in New York and across the country who suffer from dyslexia and dysgraphia. Now, you said earlier that you struggled with dyslexia as a child.
Yes.
Talk some more about how you were able to overcome your struggles.
Well, Sam, so like I said before, I was very lucky. I went to PS 230 in Kensington, Brooklyn. And in the first grade, I was a chatty, precocious kid, but I couldn't read at all. And instead of my teacher wishing away, pretending, oh, well, Bobby, he'll catch up. He's a boy, he's young for his age, he'll figure it out. She was very astute and she said, this doesn't make sense. And she said, I suspect, she was well educated. She said, I suspect that he has dyslexia. And she told that to my mom and dad. And my mom and dad had the means to go get me a neuropsychological exam. That is a battery of tests. at Columbia University. And that test confirmed what they suspected, that I was struggling with dyslexia. And then in the middle of the second grade, I went to a school called the Gateway School on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And that school was founded by a bunch of moms, really, who had kids who were struggling with dyslexia, and the local public schools weren't doing anything about it. And that school saved my life, right? The teachers there, I still remember them, Toby Polanco and Virginia Nudell and Dr. Sherwood. There were only about 36 kids in that school. I was very lucky. Um, but it gave me the intensive literacy instruction I needed to become a strong reader. I then went to the Windward School, which was another school for middle school that also worked with kids with dyslexia, and it made me an even stronger student. And then, I went to Xaverian High School and SUNY Binghamton and New York Law School. It changed my life. And I realized how lucky I was. And you shouldn't have to be lucky to learn how to read. And what I've spent the last 9 years in the state legislature trying to do is to make sure that all our kids in our state, no matter where they come from, are as lucky as I was. And so that's why we've passed this bill to make sure that every public school has a standard uh, and a plan to remediate dyslexia. That's why we passed last year a bill called the Dyslexia Diagnosis Act, which is a first in the nation to require medical insurance to cover the cost of a neuropsychological exam. So, neuropsychological exams before that were never covered by insurance anywhere in America. That bill now does require it, and before that, these tests would cost five, six, $7,000. Now we need to expand it to make sure that Medicaid and Medicare cover it. We're going to need help from the federal government because, of course, not everybody in our state has private insurance. Um, and we are going to keep working on this issue because I understand, there's so much opportunity and potential in our state, but so much of that is squandered because young people quit on themselves in the third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade because they can't read. And I know how that feels. And I know that, I think my life would be very different if I was 11, 12 years old and I couldn't have read at all and I couldn't read at all, what I would have done and what choices I would have made. And, that's a tragedy. And it's a tragedy we can stop. And it's a tragedy we know how to stop. And so, it's something that I'm deeply focused on and care about. And I care about it because dyslexia, like so many things in life, is hereditary, right? It runs in families. Uh, it doesn't mean it exclusively runs in families, but it does. So, I have two little boys who are 1 year old and 3 years old. I don't know if they'll have the struggles I have, but I'd like them to go to the public school that's down the block from my house. And I'd like them, if they do have dyslexia, to be able to get the help they need right there and not have to, go to Manhattan or get fancy tutors or anything like that. I don't think that's a good idea. And so I'm positive we can do it if we prioritize it.
You mentioned the word hereditary. Now, is this from both parents or just one of two
Look,
parents?
I think that is beyond me, Sam. But I think that I think you can, uh, dyslexia. I think it can be passed on from either parent. And I think that a family history. One of the things we're working on right now is also to work with pediatricians. And as a young father, I know how intimidating a pediatrician's office can be. It could especially be right if you have dyslexia and you don't know it, right? Maybe you do struggle to read and they give you lots of forms and they ask you lots of questions. And here's a person in a white coat with fancy credentials. Um, but we need to get people to ask questions about, has anybody struggled? Did people struggle to learn how to read in your household, or did you struggle to learn how to read? And now sometimes people struggle to learn how to read not because they have dyslexia, but because there were other reasons going on, right? There were poor schools or there weren't resources. And so I don't want to suggest that every person who struggled to read has dyslexia, but asking these questions and doing it in a sensitive way to try to figure these things out can then help your children, because you can say, just a second, I know that this is an issue, because reading gains present themselves early on. A child who's in a school that is properly resourced and has a good foundational curriculum, 5, 6 year olds are going to start making real gains in reading attainment. And you'll see it, and it'll persist. And children who are not making that attainment, you'll see it, and that too will persist unless you make a change. And one of the biggest issues we've had is that we didn't have sound pedagogy throughout our schools. And so we would have schools sometimes, and we still do, unfortunately, where lots of children are not reading. And of course, not all of those children have dyslexia. And so that's why we desperately need good instruction for all kids, because not only is it good for everybody, it'll make it much easier to figure out who's struggling and why.
I know you politicians, you assembly members love to talk, but we've only got 30 seconds, and I want you to use these 30 seconds to talk about how people can use the Center for Dyslexia.
Well, so we need the governor to pass it into law. I sign it into law. We've passed it. She needs to sign it into law. She hasn't signed it yet. So please reach out to the governor and urge her to sign the bill. And then once she does, and I think she will, you know, they are going to hire a staff. They are going to be taking recommendations. People need to engage with it, and people need to make sure that their schools are aware of it, and so that that good professional development and best practices is disseminated down to the local schools.
Such great information. Thank you so much, Assemblyman Carroll. And we hope to have you back at some time to talk about the progress that you have been able to make, even with other bills that you're working on. Again, thank you very much for being on Brooklyn 45.
Thank you, Sam.
And to your viewers, we thank you for watching this program. We invite you to partner with Brooklyn 45. You can do this in many different ways. We are a 501c3 community television program. So when you support us with a gift, you benefit and our communities benefit from what we discuss. So please tell your family, your friends, and your colleagues to watch Brooklyn 45 TV programs on cable television and on YouTube, and to visit our Facebook page. Please support and be a part of what we do. On behalf of our Brooklyn 45 team, I am Sam Taitt.
Brooklyn 45 is a 501c3 not-for-profit, and we welcome your support. Check out our website, brooklyn45.com, and feel free to donate or share it with your friends and family. Have any comments or questions? Send them to our Facebook, facebook.com/Brooklyn45TV. If you have any questions or topics you think we should cover next, shoot me an email over at brooklyn45tv@gmail.com. Thank you again for watching.